The airline manager, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail but also for his occasional arrogance, walked briskly down the crowded terminal, holding a sleek, golden-edged ticket in his hand. It gleamed under the overhead lights, catching the eyes of a few nearby passengers, who wondered if it was some kind of VIP access or a special promotional giveaway. Smiling, the manager raised the ticket slightly, as if presenting a prized possession to the world, and began sharing it openly with anyone who would glance his way. He spoke with a casual pride, explaining how this ticket offered priority boarding, access to exclusive lounges, and even a complimentary upgrade if the flight was full. His tone carried a mixture of authority and delight, a subtle display of power that he believed came with his position. Around him, a small crowd began to gather, not out of genuine interest in the ticket, but more out of curiosity toward the spectacle he was creating. People whispered softly to one another, commenting on his confidence and his slightly pompous manner, but none paid close attention to the individual the ticket was truly meant for. At first, it seemed like just another public display of the airline manager's ego. He laughed lightly as he handed the ticket over to a colleague for a quick inspection, patting the man on the shoulder in a gesture meant to emphasize camaraderie, though it came across more like condescension. Meanwhile, in the background, passengers moved slowly toward the boarding gates, carrying their luggage and sipping coffee, completely oblivious to the quiet tension that was about to unfold. Then she appeared. The young black girl, no older than 18 or 19, stepped into the terminal with a calm, deliberate stride. She wore simple yet elegant clothing, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. There was an undeniable air of confidence about her, a presence that drew attention without effort. The subtle shift in the atmosphere was almost imperceptible at first. The crowd didn't immediately react, but those closer to the manager began to glance her way, sensing that something was unusual. There was a poise in her posture, a quiet authority in the way she held herself, and a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she was not merely another traveler but someone who belonged somewhere far beyond the ordinary. As she moved closer, the manager continued his theatrics, unaware of the weight that accompanied her approach. He smiled and gestured at the ticket as if it were an award he had won rather than a responsibility he was entrusted to handle. His voice carried through the terminal, confident and commanding. He spoke about loyalty programs, rewards, and the special privileges this ticket afforded, imagining himself as the central figure in a moment of grand generosity. But with each word, the young girl's eyes tracked him carefully, analyzing, calculating, observing. She did not react with overt indignation or hostility, but there was a subtle recognition in her expression that the manager would have missed if he had been even slightly perceptive. She knew something the manager did not. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, hinted at knowledge that could alter the entire dynamic of power in the room. To the casual observer, she seemed like any other passenger, but to those attuned to details, her composure was an announcement in itself. The manager, basking in his own self-importance, finally held the ticket out for the girl to take. His hand extended in a manner that suggested he was bestowing a gift upon a lesser individual, someone to be momentarily acknowledged before being allowed to continue with their journey. There was an unspoken expectation in the air, a silent assumption that she would be grateful, polite, and deferential. Yet the girl did not react in the way he anticipated. She did not reach immediately for the ticket, nor did she smile or nod. Instead, she let the moment stretch, letting the crowd sense a tension they had not anticipated. Her presence caused an almost imperceptible pause in the rhythm of the terminal, the kind that hints at something significant about to happen. As her hand finally accepted the ticket, the manager leaned back slightly, satisfied with what he believed was the culmination of a successful public display. He continued to speak, outlining the ticket's benefits in greater detail, unaware that every word he uttered was now being weighed against an unseen authority he had not recognized. The young girl's fingers touched the ticket lightly, her grip firm but controlled. She examined it almost casually, yet there was a subtle acknowledgement in the way her eyes flicked from the ticket to the manager and back again. It was a silent signal, a quiet reminder that while he had been so focused on his display of superiority, he had overlooked the reality that she held a power far greater than his own. Around them, the passengers began to sense the unusual tension, though they did not yet understand its origin. A mother with a stroller glanced over and felt a shiver of curiosity. Business travelers shifted in their seats, sensing the subtle electricity in the air. The manager remained oblivious, caught in his own performance, unaware that the narrative of control had shifted in a single moment. The young girl's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with his self-assured posturing, highlighting the imbalance that the untrained eye could not immediately detect. Every casual gesture of his, every proud word spoken, was being silently measured against the quiet but undeniable authority she embodied. As the boarding process began, the manager led the way, assuming the role of guide and orchestrator. He gestured toward the gate, motioned for the girl to follow, and spoke again, this time with slightly more familiarity, attempting to humanize the display of hierarchy he had created. Yet, for every word, every gesture, the girl responded with a calm intelligence that subtly undermined his assumptions. She moved with purpose, yet with no need to assert dominance, her presence alone commanding respect without a single word. Passengers who had been watching now began to exchange glances, some whispering to one another. There was a palpable sense that something remarkable was unfolding, though no one could yet articulate what it was. The manager, absorbed in his own sense of control, remained blissfully unaware that his actions, meant to project authority, were in fact revealing his own naivety. Each step he took, each instruction he offered, highlighted the contrast between his superficial power and her substantive influence. When they reached the gate, the manager attempted a final flourish, offering to personally escort her onto the plane. He spoke with a tone meant to impress the nearby passengers, as if performing for an invisible audience. The girl smiled faintly, a smile that conveyed neither fear nor arrogance but quiet assurance. It was the kind of smile that signaled comprehension, mastery, and the kind of subtle power that could shift destinies. In that moment, the manager should have recognized the truth, the reality that he had been interacting not with a mere passenger, but with someone whose decisions could impact the company he represented. Yet he did not. She stepped onto the jet with composed grace, the ticket securely in hand. As she moved down the aisle, she acknowledged the passengers with polite nods, but her focus remained on the manager, whose expression finally faltered as he began to sense that the equilibrium had shifted. The subtle authority she carried was undeniable, and even the other crew members noticed the change in the energy of the cabin. What had begun as a simple display of a ticket handed out in public had now become a lesson in oversight, in the hidden realities of power that often go unnoticed until they are impossible to ignore. As the plane prepared for departure, the young girl seated herself, still exuding an air of quiet command. The manager, seated nearby, could not shake a creeping awareness that something significant had occurred, though he could not yet fully articulate what. Passengers exchanged glances, some with amusement, others with curiosity, and a few with respect. The ticket, once a symbol of privilege and performance, had quietly become a symbol of misjudged assumptions, of overlooked authority, and of the profound consequences that can arise when one underestimates another. The cabin fell into a hushed anticipation as the engines roared to life. The manager finally realized that the girl he had dismissed with a casual assumption of inferiority held a power he could neither command nor ignore. His earlier confidence faltered, replaced by the unsettling understanding that appearances often deceive, and that quiet authority can outweigh the loudest displays of ego. The young girl's calm presence, her quiet confidence, and her assured control over the situation had shifted the narrative entirely. The passengers, now fully aware of the subtle drama that had unfolded before them, watched with fascination and a new respect for the young woman whose quiet demeanor had revealed a depth of influence that few could anticipate. In that moment, it became clear to everyone present that power does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks softly, speaks gently, and observes silently, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. The manager, having learned a lesson in humility, could only watch as the plane prepared for takeoff, the young girl's presence a constant reminder that underestimating someone based on appearances can have consequences far beyond what one imagines. What had started as a simple act of sharing a ticket had evolved into a profound lesson on perception, authority, and the unforeseen impact of underappreciated power. The flight would continue, the passengers would carry on with their journeys, but the memory of that moment, the quiet shift in authority, the subtle yet undeniable command of the young girl, would linger, a testament to the fact that true influence often arrives unannounced, yet its effects are impossible to ignore. As she held the ticket delicately between her fingers, the airline manager laughed lightly, a sound meant to convey joviality but that inadvertently revealed a hint of superiority. He glanced around at his colleagues, gesturing with exaggerated casualness as he made remarks that he thought were witty, comments about the perks of the ticket, the luck of passengers who received such privileges, and how extraordinary it was that he, in his position, had the opportunity to oversee such a distribution. His words were coated with arrogance, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that only grows when a person is entirely unaware of the reality around them. To him, the ticket was nothing more than an object, a symbol of control and a chance to assert influence over the passengers around him. He had no idea that the very thing he held in his hand was not just a ticket, it was a key, a silent emblem of power that could shift the balance of authority within his company and beyond. The girl, calm and composed, observed him closely. Her eyes were steady, unflinching, reflecting intelligence, patience, and an understanding of far more than the manager could ever hope to comprehend. She did not react to his laughter with amusement or flustered confusion. Instead, she maintained an almost imperceptible smile, a quiet acknowledgement that she understood the theater that was unfolding, even as she remained an unassuming participant. Passengers nearby noticed the subtle tension, though few could articulate exactly what it was. There was something in her demeanor, in the way she held herself, that suggested she was not just any ordinary traveler. Her posture was relaxed but commanding, her grip on the ticket confident, yet understated. Every movement she made was deliberate, measured, and imbued with an authority that seemed to radiate without any overt display. Around them, the terminal buzzed with the usual energy of a busy airport, announcements over the loudspeakers, the clattering of rolling luggage, the occasional shout of a parent trying to corral a child. But in the midst of all this, the space around the manager and the girl seemed charged, almost suspended. The manager, oblivious to the subtle shift in energy, continued to speak, leaning slightly toward a colleague to make a humorous aside, imagining that his charm and wit were being appreciated. He commented on how rare it was to hold such a ticket, how it signified a level of prestige few would ever experience, and how the recipient should feel exceptionally fortunate. He laughed again, louder this time, expecting his colleagues to echo his amusement. Some did, politely, but others began to exchange fleeting glances toward the girl, sensing something unusual that they could not yet define. The girl listened attentively, nodding lightly, her expression calm and controlled. She did not correct him, did not interrupt, and did not react in a way that might have revealed the depth of her authority prematurely. Instead, she allowed him to continue, knowing that his overconfidence would only make the revelation that was about to come all the more impactful. She understood the significance of patience, of timing, and of subtlety, and she used that understanding as a quiet shield against his unwitting arrogance. To the casual observer, it appeared as though she was merely being polite, yet beneath that surface lay a formidable awareness that she held the power to shape the outcome of events far beyond the immediate situation. As the manager continued to speak, detailing the perks of the ticket with growing enthusiasm, he reached out to tap the girl lightly on the shoulder, a gesture meant to assert camaraderie but that instead highlighted his misjudgment. She turned her head ever so slightly, meeting his gaze with a measured calm that immediately unsettled him, though he could not yet pinpoint why. There was a stillness in her eyes, an almost imperceptible firmness, that hinted at the fact that the dynamics he assumed were in his control were anything but. The passengers around them began to notice the subtle power imbalance. A few whispered quietly, exchanging speculative glances, sensing that there was more to this girl than met the eye. A businessman paused mid-step, a mother halted her child's movement, and even the airline staff nearby stiffened slightly, all responding to an energy they could feel but not yet fully comprehend. The girl held the ticket lightly, almost reverently, yet with complete control. She examined it casually, allowing the manager to continue his speech, seemingly absorbed in his own performance. His laughter, meant to display confidence, now began to feel out of place, almost hollow in the charged atmosphere. He gestured broadly, attempting to draw attention to the importance of the ticket, explaining that it was reserved for someone special, someone exceptional. He believed, naively, that he was creating a moment of prestige, of recognition, unaware that the girl he addressed carried with her not just a ticket, but the power to influence decisions, shape policies, and affect the very future of the airline he so proudly represented. Each word he spoke, each casual laugh, only emphasized the gap between perception and reality. The manager's assumptions were transparent, and the girl's calm awareness contrasted sharply with his superficial confidence. She did not need to raise her voice or assert dominance, her presence alone was enough to command attention. The passengers, increasingly attentive, began to sense the tension, although few could understand its root. The atmosphere seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the air itself acknowledged the presence of someone whose influence extended far beyond the terminal walls. The manager's colleagues, initially amused by his humor and theatrics, began to sense something subtle as well. Their polite smiles faltered as they noticed the girl's composed demeanor. A quiet realization began to dawn on them that the person standing before them was not merely a passenger or a recipient of the ticket but someone who could alter the company's trajectory with a single decision. They exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier amusement giving way to a muted recognition of significance they had not anticipated. The manager, however, remained blissfully unaware. He continued his commentary, gesturing toward the ticket, describing lounges, upgrades, and exclusive services, believing he was orchestrating a moment of admiration. The girl, with quiet assurance, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, and polite, yet it carried an authority that cut through the manager's self-assured narrative like a knife. She asked a simple question about the validity of the ticket, phrased in such a way that it revealed not only her knowledge of airline operations but also an implicit understanding of corporate hierarchy. The manager froze, caught off guard by her tone, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He attempted to laugh it off, to regain control of the moment, but the confidence in her voice lingered, unyielding. The passengers and staff now began to pay closer attention, sensing that a shift had occurred, that the woman before them was far more than she seemed. The girl's presence began to change the energy of the terminal. Even without making any overt moves, she commanded the space with a subtle, almost imperceptible force. People unconsciously adjusted their behavior, stepping back slightly, giving her more room, their glances betraying a newfound respect. The manager, for the first time in the encounter, felt the weight of being underestimated. He realized, too late, that the girl he had dismissed with a casual assumption of inferiority was in fact someone whose decisions could affect his own career, and potentially the future of the airline itself. He attempted to regain composure, trying to steer the conversation back to familiar territory, but every word now seemed hollow. The authority he thought he wielded was suddenly revealed as fragile, superficial, dependent entirely on appearances. The girl, meanwhile, remained composed, patient, and unwavering. She held the ticket confidently, not as a symbol of entitlement, but as a reminder of the responsibility she carried, the influence she possessed, and the consequences that could arise from underestimating her. The tension in the terminal was palpable. Passengers whispered quietly, crew members exchanged wary glances, and even the manager's colleagues could not ignore the shift in dynamics. He was no longer the orchestrator of events, the girl had subtly taken control, her quiet authority undeniable. Every gesture, every word, and every glance from her carried weight, influencing those around her without overt effort. The manager's laughter had faded, replaced by an uneasy awareness that he was no longer in charge of the situation, that his assumptions had blinded him to the reality standing before him. As boarding announcements echoed through the terminal, the girl walked calmly toward the gate, ticket in hand, moving with deliberate poise. Each step reinforced her composure, her quiet power, and the certainty that she was not merely participating in the moment but shaping it. The manager followed, still attempting to maintain a semblance of control, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Passengers, crew, and colleagues all sensed it. What had begun as a casual distribution of a ticket had transformed into a subtle but profound revelation. Appearances could deceive, arrogance could blind, and quiet authority could command far more than loud declarations ever could. When she reached her seat, the manager finally understood the truth, though he struggled to articulate it. The young girl he had underestimated, whose presence had seemed inconsequential, was in fact a force to be reckoned with. The ticket, which he had treated as a mere object of privilege, had been a symbol of underestimated power. The passengers settled into their seats, the hum of the engines beginning, and the manager could not shake the realization that his casual oversight had exposed him to a lesson in humility, perception, and the unpredictable nature of influence. He watched, silently, as the girl prepared for the flight, her calm demeanor and assured presence leaving a lasting impression on everyone around her. In that moment, the manager recognized that his laughter, his casual remarks, and his sense of superiority had all been illusions. Real authority did not announce itself with jokes or gestures, it existed quietly, confidently, and indomitably, and it was a force that could never be ignored. The young girl, with her quiet poise, had demonstrated this truth effortlessly, and the impact of that revelation would resonate far beyond the confines of the terminal, leaving a lesson that he, and those who had witnessed it, would carry long into the future. The cabin, which had been bustling with the usual energy of travelers preparing for departure, suddenly seemed to shift. Conversations that had been casual and light trailed off into hushed tones, the usual hum of activity replaced by an almost imperceptible tension. Flight attendants moved quietly, their steps lighter, their gestures more measured as they exchanged subtle glances. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, low and cautious, filled with speculation and curiosity. Something about the young girl had captured their attention in a way that none of them could ignore. It wasn't just her presence, it was the aura she carried, the quiet but unmistakable authority that seemed to emanate from her. Every motion she made, every slight tilt of her head, conveyed a confidence and intelligence far beyond her apparent years. The passengers, oblivious at first, began to notice the subtle energy that had shifted within the cabin. Some paused mid-step, clutching their belongings a little tighter as they exchanged curious looks with those around them. Others simply observed, intrigued but unsure of what to make of the change in atmosphere. The airline manager, however, remained entirely unaware. He moved through the cabin with his usual bravado, giving instructions with an air of authority that he assumed was unquestioned. He smiled at passengers, directed staff, and handed out what he considered helpful advice, completely oblivious to the fact that the balance of power had already shifted. His words carried the same tone of casual command he had displayed earlier in the terminal, but now, in this charged environment, they seemed almost performative, a stark contrast to the subtle control the young girl now wielded. Every instruction he gave, every friendly gesture he offered, was observed not just by the staff and passengers but by someone who had the power to change the outcome of the situation entirely. He believed he was orchestrating the cabin, managing the flow and maintaining order, yet he was unaware that the real order had already been established, dictated quietly and firmly by the girl he had underestimated. As he passed, his gaze briefly met hers. It was a fleeting connection, a moment so brief that most onlookers might have missed it entirely, but in that instant, a faint smirk appeared on her face. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She did not need to speak to assert her presence, the smirk alone conveyed a message. She understood the situation fully. She knew exactly what was happening and, more importantly, knew the extent of her own power within it. The manager, entirely oblivious to the meaning behind that small expression, continued with his performance, unaware that the quiet authority he assumed he commanded was now in her hands. The faint smirk was her silent declaration, a subtle warning that the equilibrium he thought he controlled had already been disrupted. The cabin staff, now aware of the girl's influence, moved with heightened attention. Flight attendants adjusted their routines, their movements more precise, their communications quieter but more purposeful. They exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of intrigue, respect, and caution. It was as if an unspoken understanding had passed among them. This was no ordinary passenger. The young girl's calm confidence had communicated a silent authority that demanded acknowledgement without confrontation. Even the seasoned crew, accustomed to managing challenging passengers and complex situations, sensed the difference immediately. There was an air of gravity, a subtle tension that rippled through the cabin, marking the presence of someone whose influence extended far beyond what was immediately visible. Passengers, meanwhile, were slowly drawn into the awareness of the shifting dynamics. Some noticed the change in the staff's behavior and instinctively adjusted their own movements, following unwritten rules that seemed to emerge spontaneously. Others, curious and attentive, observed the girl, noting her composed posture, the calm certainty in her movements, and the subtle way she carried herself through the aisle. There was an unspoken recognition that this young woman was not merely occupying space but actively shaping the environment around her. Every glance, every small gesture she made carried significance, commanding attention without a single word. The manager remained unaware of the ripple effect that had already begun, believing that his familiar presence and gestures were the center of control, when in fact the entire cabin had subtly realigned itself around the young girl's quiet authority. She moved with deliberate grace, each step measured and precise, maintaining composure as she navigated the cabin. Passengers instinctively gave her space, stepping aside slightly or lowering their voices, as if unconsciously acknowledging her command. Even the most distracted travelers found themselves observing her with curiosity, sensing a confidence that transcended the ordinary. She exuded calm, decisiveness, and an almost imperceptible power that seemed to influence everyone within proximity. Her presence alone altered the atmosphere, and the whispers among the staff grew as they began to speculate about who she might be. It was clear to them, even without full knowledge, that this was someone who wielded influence, someone whose decisions could carry weight far beyond the immediate moment. The manager, still operating under the assumption that he was directing events, approached a flight attendant with a cheerful smile and a casual remark. He handed over instructions for seat arrangements, suggested adjustments for passenger comfort, and attempted to engage in light conversation about in-flight amenities. Yet with every word he spoke, the young girl's gaze followed him calmly, her eyes steady and unyielding. Her presence seemed to absorb and redirect his energy. Where he intended to assert control, she maintained quiet dominance. Her slight smirk remained, a signal that she understood both the situation and the true scope of her influence. The manager's words, meant to command, now felt almost hollow, their impact diminished by the invisible authority she radiated. The tension continued to build subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Crew members exchanged quiet comments, noting her composure and the ease with which she navigated the space. They began to recognize the power she held, not through loud declarations, but through the sheer confidence of her presence. The manager's oblivion only heightened the contrast, emphasizing the difference between superficial authority and substantive influence. He believed that his position and experience granted him control, yet the girl's calm assurance demonstrated that true authority does not need to announce itself, it simply exists, quietly shaping the environment and the actions of those around it. She moved toward her assigned seat, maintaining eye contact with the manager for a fleeting moment. That brief connection conveyed a silent message, a subtle reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that assumptions about power could be misleading, and that influence often resided where it was least expected. The faint smirk lingered in the corner of her lips, understated but powerful, a signal that she was fully aware of the situation and her role within it. The manager, lost in his own assumptions and routines, missed the nuance entirely, continuing his actions with the same misguided confidence as before. Passengers watched with a mixture of curiosity and intrigue. Some were drawn by her calm demeanor, others by the subtle tension that seemed to radiate from her interactions with the staff. A few whispered quietly, speculating about her identity, her purpose, and the significance of her presence. The cabin, once filled with mundane chatter and the predictable routines of travel, had transformed into a space of quiet anticipation, a theater of subtle power dynamics. The young girl's authority had reshaped the environment, influencing both staff and passengers in ways that were both profound and almost imperceptible. The manager continued to hand out instructions, unaware that the real orchestration had already shifted. Every movement he made, every gesture of authority, was now contextualized against the subtle dominance of the young girl. Her calm presence underscored the limitations of his superficial control, highlighting the contrast between the visible, performative authority he wielded and the quiet, effective power she exercised effortlessly. The whispers among the staff grew louder, but still discreet, as they shared their observations and acknowledged the unspoken command she carried. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the young girl finally settled into her seat, her posture straight and confident. The manager paused nearby, still attempting to maintain a sense of command, but a creeping awareness began to unsettle him. He sensed, vaguely and uncomfortably, that the balance of authority had shifted. The cabin, previously organized under his assumption of control, now functioned under a different, unseen order, one dictated by the quiet presence of the girl. Even passengers who had been indifferent began to recognize the subtle influence she exerted, feeling it in the mannerisms of the staff, the spacing in the aisle, and the energy of the cabin itself. The faint smirk she had offered earlier persisted, subtle but ever present. It was a reminder that she understood not only the immediate situation but the broader implications of her presence. She had demonstrated control without confrontation, authority without aggression, and influence without overt assertion. The manager, for all his experience and confidence, could only watch, realizing too late that he had underestimated the depth of her power. The whispers of the staff, once casual and speculative, now carried weight, acknowledging the presence of someone whose authority transcended the obvious and reached into the core of decision-making and influence. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi toward the runway, the cabin settled into a tense calm. The manager, seated nearby, could not shake the awareness of the subtle shift that had occurred. The young girl, calm and composed, held her posture and her gaze, an unspoken signal of her command over the situation. Passengers adjusted unconsciously, crew members moved with quiet attentiveness, and the atmosphere remained charged with anticipation. In that moment, the young girl had proven that true authority does not need to assert itself loudly. It simply exists, recognized by those perceptive enough to notice, and capable of shaping outcomes without a single spoken word. The manager's earlier laughter and casual remarks now seemed hollow in retrospect, overshadowed by the quiet confidence and power emanating from the girl. What had begun as a routine boarding process had transformed into a subtle but profound lesson on perception, authority, and the consequences of underestimating someone based on appearances. The cabin, now united in a shared, almost unspoken acknowledgement, recognized the shift. The young girl had established herself as a force to be reckoned with, and the manager, along with those around him, would carry the memory of this encounter long after the flight had concluded. The faint smirk remained, a silent testament to the power of quiet confidence and the extraordinary impact of understated authority. Seconds later, the truth broke in a way no one in the cabin could have anticipated. What had begun as a quiet undercurrent of tension suddenly crystallized into a moment of unmistakable clarity. A senior flight attendant approached the airline manager with a tablet in hand, her expression carefully neutral but her posture unusually rigid. She leaned in and spoke in a low voice, but the manager's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His smile vanished. The color drained from his face. His body stiffened as though every muscle had locked at once. Whatever she had shown him or said to him struck with the force of a revelation he was not prepared to face. In that instant, the confident authority he had worn so comfortably shattered, replaced by disbelief and a creeping sense of dread. The manager stared at the screen, then slowly lifted his eyes toward the girl. For the first time since this encounter began, he truly looked at her, not as a passenger, not as a recipient of a ticket, but as someone whose presence carried consequences. His throat tightened, and his lips parted slightly as if he wanted to speak but could not find the words. The realization hit him with brutal clarity: the girl he had casually dismissed, joked about, and underestimated held authority over him. Not symbolic authority. Not distant influence. Real power. Power that could affect his career, his reputation, and the future of the company he thought he represented so confidently. A hush swept through the cabin. Passengers sensed the shift immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Eyes widened. People leaned subtly into the aisle, instinctively aware that they were witnessing something rare and significant. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. The manager, once so animated and commanding, now stood motionless, his hands trembling ever so slightly at his sides. The transformation was so sudden and so complete that it felt almost unreal. The girl remained seated, calm and composed, her posture relaxed yet unmistakably assured. She did not rush to speak or make a display of her authority. She did not need to. The truth had already spoken for her. Her eyes met the manager's steadily, without anger or triumph, only quiet certainty. There was no need for confrontation. No need for raised voices. The balance of power had shifted decisively, and everyone in the cabin could feel it. The manager swallowed hard and took a step back, his earlier confidence collapsing into visible unease. He glanced around, perhaps hoping for support, but found none. His colleagues avoided his gaze. The flight attendants stood straighter, their attention subtly redirecting toward the girl. Even the passengers, strangers who knew nothing of the internal hierarchy of the airline, could sense who now held control. Authority had changed hands, not through force or spectacle, but through truth. Whispers rippled through the cabin, growing louder as comprehension spread. A few passengers exchanged stunned looks. Others leaned toward one another, murmuring questions and theories. The shock was not just that the girl had authority, but that she had carried it so quietly, allowing the manager to reveal himself through his own careless behavior. His laughter, his remarks, his casual dismissal now replayed in everyone's mind with new meaning. What had once seemed confident now looked reckless. What had seemed harmless now appeared deeply misguided. The manager finally spoke, his voice noticeably strained. He addressed the girl with a formality that had been entirely absent before, his tone careful, almost deferential. The shift was unmistakable. Gone was the man who had handed out instructions with easy arrogance. In his place stood someone scrambling to regain footing on ground that had suddenly disappeared beneath him. His words sounded rehearsed, defensive, and hollow, each one reinforcing the reality of his misjudgment. The girl listened without interruption. When she finally responded, her voice was calm, measured, and firm. She spoke clearly, not to humiliate him, but to establish boundaries. She addressed his actions, not with emotion, but with precision, outlining how his behavior reflected poorly on the company and violated the standards he was supposed to uphold. Every sentence landed with weight. She did not need to raise her voice, the authority behind her words carried them effortlessly. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Some felt secondhand embarrassment for the manager. Others felt a surge of admiration for the girl. There was something profoundly powerful about the way she reclaimed control without theatrics or aggression. She did not posture or threaten. She simply stated the facts, and the facts were enough. The cabin had become an audience to a lesson in leadership, accountability, and the danger of underestimating someone based on appearance. The manager nodded repeatedly, his earlier bravado replaced by visible regret. He attempted to explain himself, to soften the impact of what he had done, but his words only emphasized the truth. His actions had been careless, and now they were exposed. The presence of witnesses made the moment even more severe. This was no private correction behind closed doors. This was accountability in full view of the very people he had tried to impress. Flight attendants adjusted their positions subtly, aligning themselves with the girl's authority. One of them addressed her directly, asking if there was anything she needed before departure. The respect in her voice was unmistakable. The girl acknowledged her with a polite nod, reinforcing the new order without ever explicitly stating it. The manager stepped aside instinctively, no longer the center of attention, no longer the one directing the flow of events. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere remained charged, but it was no longer tense in the same way. The shock had settled into understanding. Passengers returned to their seats with a new awareness, replaying the moment in their minds. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled quietly, impressed by the elegance of the reversal they had just witnessed. A few glanced toward the girl with newfound respect, recognizing that true power does not need to announce itself loudly to be real. The manager took his seat, his shoulders slumped slightly, his gaze fixed forward. The weight of what had happened was clearly sinking in. He had not only lost face, but exposed his own assumptions to everyone around him. His earlier actions, once meant to assert control, now served as evidence of his failure to recognize authority when it stood right in front of him. The girl settled back into her seat, her composure unchanged. She had reclaimed her control without spectacle, without cruelty, and without hesitation. The moment did not define her, it simply revealed her. She looked out the window as the plane began to move, calm and reflective, as if this were just another responsibility handled, another situation corrected. As the aircraft lifted into the air, the cabin gradually returned to its usual rhythm. Seatbelt signs chimed, engines hummed steadily, and conversations resumed, though quieter than before. Yet something lingered. The memory of the power shift remained vivid in everyone's mind. It was the kind of moment people would later recount to friends and family, emphasizing how quickly authority can change when truth enters the room. For the manager, the flight would be long. Every second would remind him of the cost of his assumptions. For the passengers, it was an unforgettable lesson in humility and awareness. And for the girl, it was a quiet affirmation that her influence did not depend on recognition, approval, or validation. It existed regardless, waiting only for the moment it needed to be exercised. What had started as a careless display had ended as a public reckoning. The truth had surfaced, the balance of power had shifted, and the consequences were unmistakable. In that cabin, at 30,000 feet, everyone learned the same lesson: real authority does not demand attention. It commands it naturally, and when it reveals itself, there is no mistaking it.